Hey everyone, Curse Deck Builder here, making our way to 10,000 decks assisted. And today we're looking at Fynn the Fang Bearer, a Death Touch, Infect, Poison Counter deck. Or a poisoning deck. Maybe I should have said that. This deck comes to us from Sukiyaki. Thank you so much for supporting the channel. And they're saying that this deck already goes really fast, and they want to keep it that way, but they're looking for general improvements. But if the deck needs to go slower or another kind of strategy needs to happen, they are very much down for it, which I don't think I'm down for. I love Fynn the Fang Bearer, and I really like the kind of strategy it brings to Commander, and even if that's a bit controversial, and we're going to talk about that a little bit after the Commander. As always, if you wanted to see this deck list early and maybe talk about it with a few others and me about your thoughts about adding to the deck, you can join us on our Discord by going and supporting my Patreon. I believe it's as cheap as $1 a month. If you want to help out, I would appreciate it. All that to say, I'm excited to get into this deck, so let's take a look at the Commander and get right into it. If you'd like to take a look at the deck list we're talking about today, or if you'd like to submit your own deck list to me so that I can make a video assisting your deck, please check the video description down below. So who is Fynn the Fang Bearer, and why are they our mono green Death Touch poisoning deck? Well, Fynn the Fang Bearer is a very straightforward creature. For 2 mana, a human warrior 1/3 Death Touch, and says whenever a creature you control with Death Touch deals combat damage to a player, that player gets 2 poison counters. As many know, 10 poison counters is immediately knocking out a player. So you effectively change your opponent's life totals from 40 to 10. Now this is a bit of a contentious thing. Recently I was on MTG Mutz's channel, and my one of my opponents and I used my Nareev deck to use Tainted Strike that my opponent cast to knock out a player in 1 turn. And that was seen as kind of a rude and cruel thing to do. And I saw quite a few people talking about the concept of whether or not poison counters need to be nerfed or otherwise adjusted for in Commander. Now, Rule 0 aside, because you can talk with your play group and get rid of poison counters, I think poison counters are extremely fair. There is a very much so cost to playing an Infect Commander or a poison strategy, because everyone in the game immediately hones in their removal at you. They are often very afraid of taking that first hit or a few hits, so they work really hard to taking you out. And generally, I view perceived threat almost as a very real part of Commander in deck building and otherwise, and you need to be able to reduce your perceived threat so you don't get into arch enemy situations. Now, some decks can survive being arch enemy, but Fynn the Fang Bearer is not one of them. On a long enough time frame, your opponents will take you out, so you need to act fast. So I'm very much so of the mind that we need to make this deck as fast as possible and as consistent as possible. Likewise, I want to say I like what's going on here pretty much 90% of the deck. Doing our first 2 checks as we always do, we can see we have 36 lands, 39 using MDFCs, namely Turntimber Symbiosis, is really nice as coming in untapped. Colony Territory, which is off of the Ambush, and Bridgework Battle. Now, I do really like the Bridgeworks Battle comes in untapped as a bolt land. I don't really like the fact that Colony Ambush does come in tapped in a deck that wants to be really low to the ground, but we are already excluding that 38 with MDFCs, so I'm going to be pretty gentle with it. I think that's fine. Looking at the curve, on the other hand, we're kind of in a trickier situation. I think the part of the deck that I'm having the hardest time with is how high the curve is. Now, it's possible there's a conversation of how many 1-drops we're going to be playing. In fact, I'm going to be suggesting another Death Touch 1-drop. But if we were to go to Scryfall and just put in 1 mana Death Touch creatures, we have an abundance, so the question becomes, how many do you want to play? Looking here right now, we can see we're playing 11 Death Touch 1-drops. and excluding, sorry, Venerated Rot Priest, and I believe over here is the Glistener Elf. So we're technically playing 9. And I think I would like to even that out to at least 10, if not 11, 1-mana Death Touch creatures, because I would very much say they are the backbone of the deck. You want one every single game. When I play other decks that are really dependent on a 1-drop on the first turn, and I don't mean just like Brina who benefits from it, I mean dependent. So I'm thinking Pirates, I'm thinking can't remember her name, but the black-green, whenever your opponents take damage, that one needs a 1-drop every single, and you gain 6 mana. That needs one every single time. So I tend to run as many as I can, and I don't mind getting to the low 10s, like up to 13, 14. Now, we don't have infinite choices here, but we have quite a few, and I think I would go a little further than what is available here. But after that, 2 drops, we kind of go down, and I think that's fine. This deck is having a really hard time competing with Fynn on turn 2, and I think that's normal. 3 drops, we start getting a little trickier, because when we start playing cards like Deathbloom Gardener, which is a mana creature and a Death Touch creature, I start getting a little suspicious. This is not a combination that I really, really like. I would rather have another 1-mana Death Touch creature and another hold on, I gotta raise my hands, and another 1-mana elf, right? Because those add to 2 mana, not 3 mana. So this feels like a particularly weak creature that I'd like to cut. Otherwise, things like Hornet Nest, which, don't get me wrong, is really, really cute, but a little clunky when our plan is to go as fast as possible. The rest I generally like. There is no way around playing 3 drops, so I don't want to suggest we're not going to do that, but we should be somewhat aware of the ones we're playing and whether they speed us up or slow us down. As we go further, we're getting into a zone that I'm getting more and more suspicious. Abundance, for example, is really one that I do not like in this deck because, unfortunately, it's just too much mana. I'd rather the 1-drop that we're not playing, Abundant Growth, I believe, that is like a one-off abundance, where you pay 1 green, you say land or non-land, and then you go for it. I like that way, way more. And I do understand the power of abundance, but I really don't think this deck can take that turn off in order to play this. And then even then, we're not drawing that many cards to get ahead, so this is a rather clunky card. Getting to 5 drops, I'm starting to get really suspicious of the power of these cards. Bellowing Tangleworm feels particularly weak compared to the other options. Don't get me wrong, Intimidate is rather strong, but I'd still rather either equipment that gives an evasion or a cheaper non-creature based evasion thing for your board. It's just kind of clunky to play this creature knowing that you will never attack with it because it's too valuable, and at the same time, you just rather this be an enchantment or an artifact. The fact that it has a body is a detriment and a liability. Going a bit further, at least Containment Grafter I really, really like. Orhan Frostfang is okay. I think I would have preferred this to be Toski because I don't think giving Death Touch is particularly important, and being 1 less mana is a huge, huge difference. And then after that, we've got Noxious Assault. I do like it. I don't know to what degree it's going to be very powerful. This is one of those cards that I feel like you really, really need to test because I like this way better in a tokens deck or a dedicated like tokens insect deck or a tokens toxic deck. This just feels difficult to gauge, right? Because if you don't have enough creatures, your opponents are just going to block. Because otherwise they're going to be knocked out in one attack. And if you are attacking your opponent with 10 creatures and they have to have, removal and block everything, okay, I get it. This is very, very strong. But if you're playing less and they don't have any poison counters, so you're attacking with like 4 creatures at them, instead of taking 8, they'll take the 4 and just move on. So this is just kind of a card that gives your opponent a chance to make the right decision, if that makes sense. So I don't particularly like it. Whereas Overrun and an Overwhelming Stampede I like way better because that trample is particularly powerful. For those who don't know, the way trample works with Death Touch is you just have to assign 1 point of Death Touch damage to a blocker and then the rest will trample through. Which means unless they can block more creatures than the number that the Overrun and the Overwhelming Stampede provide, because let's go and do the math here. You have a 1/1 Death Touch creature, and then you get +3/+3, which means 3 blockers are not enough because that 1 point will still get through, so they'll need 1 more. With that, you'll still get the hidden, so your opponents need a lot of blockers, and I think that's a lot easier for you to work with than punishing blocks. I will say, with that in mind, this is a weird case where Overrun is stronger generally than Overwhelming Stampede, because this is the kind of deck that actually benefits way more by the +3/+3, because it struggles to get a creature with 3 power on the board to begin with, or higher. And don't get me wrong, when you have a higher creature, obviously Overwhelming Stampede is better, but most of the time I think you'd prefer Overrun, which is kind of neat. I do like that. Predatory Focus is probably the best version of this because it almost guarantees lethal in a way. I wish it wasn't 5 mana, but we are in mono green and it's difficult to make this happen otherwise. So, though some of these are pretty strong, I think the Tangleworm and the Noxious Assault are easy cuts to at least reduce that higher mana cost. Rexian Swarm Lord is one that I absolutely want you to cut. There's 2 problems with this. The main one I think that people will know is that 6 mana for this creature that doesn't do anything until your upkeep is really difficult for this deck to get going, and it costs you too much should this card get Swords to Plowshares. You might say, well, Curse, your opponent's removal is already taxed. They're not going to have enough removal for this. Yeah, maybe, but that's kind of a hard thing to gauge because they're going to be working as a team as much as they can to keep you underground. That being said, the ideal situation is your opponents have each several points of poison on them. You play the Phyrexian Swarm Lord, you get to your turn, and then bam, right? You get all of a sudden 10 to 12 poison creatures, right? The Phyrexian insects with Infect. With Infect being way stronger than Toxic, especially with a few other cards in the deck. So I see the ceiling, but this is where the second problem with this comes. And this is kind of a gameplay problem and maybe not something a lot of people have thought of. This kind of works like Vishgraz, if you've ever played Vishgraz, which is the Abzan Toxic Commander, the giant centipede. And the way that these cards work against themselves is they incentivize you to keep your opponents alive on high poison, and they punish you for knocking your opponents out, right? Vishgraz and this card get really high effects when all your opponents are at 9, but the second one of those opponents hits 10 and is knocked out of the game, you go down that exact amount, right? If you had 5/5/5 for 15 and you do 5 poison damage to one of them, you've gone from 15 to 10. So the closer the game comes to completion, the worse these cards get. Further with that thought, you are very much so de-incentivized. You really shouldn't put your opponents all at 5/5/5. Or 7/7/7, or even like 7/5/5, right? You should go 10 and then 10 and then 10. Now that's not realistically what's going to happen. It's much more likely that you'll go like 4, 2, 2, and then bump 1 to 6, like wherever you can get your attacks in. But the second you can knock out a player, you should absolutely knock out that player. Let's talk about that for a second, because once again, going back to that game I played on Muds' channel, I do notice a lot of players seem to dislike this attitude. I couldn't believe the number of comments were just like, it's mean to knock someone out of a game, it's mean to knock them out early, and something I've seen once or twice that boggles me is that you should not, as the aggro player, you should not be looking to knock players out because it creates an arch enemy situation. So the first part is kind of a attitude and a pod attitude or the rule zero conversation. But you got to remember, Commander is a game, and the rule of the game or the point of the game is to win. I think there has to be some kind of grace provided that if you end a game quickly, you can apologize to your opponent for knocking them out, but if you finish the rest of the game early, you all get to play again, and should be no harm, no foul. I can't promise that. I'm not in your pod. I'd love to be there as a fly on a wall or have a conversation with, but we just kind of got to accept that games do end. And for the strategy idea, as the aggro player, you need to knock out your opponents. It is absurd to me, the concept that you'll be somehow punished for knocking out your opponents. Nobody is blind. When you are dangerous as aggro, everyone feels it. And instead of dealing with 3 untaps and 3 whole turns before your next turn, you could get to 2 is so powerful. Knock out your opponents as fast as you can. And if you can prioritize knocking out the control players, do it. Do it. Don't feel bad. Tell them this is how aggro works. Tell them you're not rolling dice to find out who you're going to attack, and you just gotta knock them out. Otherwise, frankly, this deck cannot function. You cannot grind out opponents with this deck, and you cannot put them in situations where they can work together for longer time to beat you. And all of that to say, Rexian Swarmlord needs to be cut from the deck. It is fundamentally encouraging a playstyle that makes your deck worse. And that is a really hard thing to sometimes see, because that's not how our brains work when we play Magic, but it is something we have to learn. I think this card is neat, but it has no place here, unfortunately. Going to our 7-drops as our last cards, you're basically going to hear the same spiel as the other two. I do like Hornet Queen way better, especially with a haste enabler, so I'm not going to be super hard on it. In certain boards, this is immediate defeat for your opponents, because with this and a haste enabler for all of the creatures, that is lethal with Fynn on the battlefield, so I do like that. That being said, if you do not run enough haste enablers, like I see we have the... where is it? The Crashing Drawbridge is a really good example of one. If you do not run more, I do not see this being good enough. But if you do, it is a particularly dangerous card. On the other hand, we have Plain Wild Celebration, and I do fundamentally understand that there are only 2 lines of text here you care about, namely proliferate 4 times, or return a bunch of cards from your graveyard to your hand to get going again. I'm going to suggest that latter is not good enough, because by the time you have 7 mana, your opponents their engines are online, their cards are too big, their draw engines are going. Getting 4 1/1 creatures with Death Touch and probably waiting to your next turn to deploy all of them is just too slow. It's just not going to be good enough, and you're definitely not creating citizens or gaining life. So this is a pretty easy cut. On the other hand, no, we like Turn Timber Symbiosis. Okay, that's it. Those are my general cuts for the higher mana cards. There's, I think the rest of the deck I do rather like. I think cards like Wrap and Vigor are a little cute. I noticed there's no Heroic Intervention here, which would probably be better. But, you know, if you've got nothing else, this is great. Arachnogenesis as well is kind of cute. I do understand there are some Death Touch spiders here, which is nice. But I would argue, at what point would you rather just Fog? And in fact, maybe you should just play Fog as an additional card, because of the kind of deck that really likes Fog, because your opponent taps out for a lethal attack against you, thinking that they can overcommit because you're going to be knocked out, and a really easy Fog stops that, allowing you to tap into them and take them out. So I do really like that. Do note that Fogs are very good against you as well, so might as well play them if you are going to play against them, is the way I like to think. Okay, that's generally it. I think there is something I did want to mention, that Sereth is another card that creates Death Touch that I'm not sure I particularly like. Obviously, this line of text is way better. Other untapped creatures you control have hexproof, but I struggle. I don't know if it's worth the investment. This is one of those cards that I see often in lists, but I never see it played, and to me, it looks bad. I'll have to let the deck builder decide on that one, but if you have other experience with it, I'd love to hear it, but this is not the kind of card I particularly like. So with that in mind, let's go into additions. This one's the easiest one. Dragon Sniper is a new card we got that has the 1/1 Death Touch and 2 other, I believe, very, very relevant abilities. I really like that Dragon Sniper is particularly good on defense. Vigilance is really, really nice. And there's a few tricks you can do using that reach, vigilance, and other abilities that I do like. Very, very clean creature. Very, very easy to include. Moving on, this is a non-death touch creature that I do want to talk about because I've had some experience with this in Vishgraz and in Bumbleflower, and I wanted to talk about it as a proliferate enabler. As we already have in the deck over here, we have the... Where is our 3 mana? There we go. The Bloated Contaminator. And if anyone's ever played with the Contaminator or any other deal combat damage, proliferate cards, they know there's an innate very, very high level of power. The thing is this is really nice because it has this nice little combo that it gives the counter and then it proliferates the counter. It's a very, very clean card. And with that in mind, the Park Heights Maverick works a little bit like this, right? So instead of giving a poison counter, it has Dethrone. And so when you attack the opponent with the most life, it grows by itself prior to the attack. So it usually attacks as a 3/3. Then it has that really nice line of evasion text where it can get through a bunch of really small blockers, something this deck kind of struggles with. And then it has that line where it deals combat damage, it proliferates, allowing you to proliferate a bunch of +1/+1 counters, the poison counters, and of course the +1/+1 counter on this card. But, and this is the final thing, is why I really think it's an elegant card, is that this also triggers on its death, which is kind of rare to have so much relevant text on this, because I do really, really like this, because if you get board wiped or otherwise you get a bunch of removal, at least Park Heights Maverick has one additional proliferate on it that I think can be really, really relevant. I've generally been very impressed by this card. I think it does a lot of really relevant things, and for that, I do like it. Moving forward, this is a card that I have a really hard time not immediately advocating for, but I do note the financial cost to it. There's going to be at least one more card here that I know is expensive, and I usually do not like suggesting expensive cards, but it is worth mentioning, especially in a deck that wants to go fast. For those who haven't seen videos, I'll give the whole spiel for this, and Mass Hysteria is another card that does the same thing. All creatures have haste, means your opponents are incentivized to attack. If they are attacking, that means they are not blocking. And if all players are not blocking because they're attacking immediately, the most aggressive and consistent player will win the game. And I'm going to say that if Fynn the Fangbearer is not the most aggressive and consistent deck at the table, something is wrong with the deck building. So with that, it's really easy to advocate for this because you're going to be rewarded more than your opponents. And in fact, this is one of those situations where your opponents are incentivized to not attack, which means we've turned all creatures have haste to all creatures you control have haste, and that is insane, right? That is a huge power up just by your opponents playing, I would argue, correctly. And that is really, really cool in a deck like this. Moving on, this is a card that I really like putting in decks that are super reliant on their commander. It halves commander tax, and it gives you a little bit of benefit that every single time you lose your commander, you get to at least draw a card, giving you some form of, I'm going to say card advantage, because you don't ever cast your commander from your hand, so you're kind of going up a card every time this happens. Fynn going from 2, 4, 6 sucks. But going from 2, 3, 4, 5, so on, way, way more easy to deal with, and therefore I think this is particularly good. Remember, obviously, this isn't something that needs to be on the battlefield for a long time, or like when Fynn dies or in previous casts. The second you play this, the effect comes into play, and commander tax is halved of all the tax you have to pay. So this is a card I really, really do like here. After that, I wanted to add at least one more bite effect. These decks can run a lot of bite effects. It's really up to you. Horrific Assault is here to represent any bite effect that's 1 mana, and even some 2 mana bite effects. Just the idea that this is a card that is particularly good. With that many Death Touch creatures, Horrific Assault as a one-sided fight means it's 1 mana removal most of the time. Of course, it does really get you in bad situations when your opponents do have removal, because they can destroy the creature you're about to bite with. But with that in mind, this is one of the few ways your deck can have a political angle to it. When your opponents are dealing with another deck or another creature that they're worried about, you can advocate to use your Horrific Assault to destroy that creature and buy yourself some goodwill. You're usually going to then attack the player whose creature you destroyed and hopefully knock them out. And in the long run, that goodwill benefits you way more than anyone else. So there's this thing about politics in Commander that I want to take a moment to say, where the trick is not giving your opponents what they want. The trick is doing what you need to do to win and convincing your opponents that it's good for them. And maybe, I don't know, maybe that's a little sneakier than most players would like. I don't know for sure, but I mean, it's just good, good business in a competitive game to allow your opponents to do what you want and have them think that they're better off for it. So I would advocate for that for sure. Moving on, Emerald Medallion is another card that I think is a very, very easy include. There's usually the test we run where we kind of figure out how many cards in the deck can be affected by Emerald Medallion. And in a mono green deck, it's a lot. Now, don't get me wrong, obviously all the artifacts and the 1 artifact creature don't get that effect, and all of the 1 mana, 1 green creatures also don't get that effect, but looking at the rest of the deck, I still think that's enough. I think this is really, really nice. It does work really well as an additional kind of relief on command tax, so I do like it. I think you should play it, and I love this new art. I don't know if it's new art, actually. No. I love this consistent art. I just like it, so you should play it. Going into equipment, I want to talk about Cloak of the Bat real quick. Flying Haste. 2 to play, 2 to equip. It's a bit of a clunky card when you compare it to some of the other options, but when it works, it's very, very strong, as it is a haste enabler and evasion enabler package all in one. So I like it in terms of efficiency. Bouncing to something way more expensive, maybe those two should have been different orders. Mox Amber. I really don't like often advocating for 0 mana artifacts or fast mana in Commander, but if we are saying that we're going to be a fast deck and the best cards in our deck are 1 mana and our Commander is 2 mana, Mox Amber, if you have the means to buy or proxy it, whew, what a fantastic card. It's just really, really strong to be able to go Fynn, Mox Amber, Death Touch creature all on the second turn. Obviously, as you do this, note you're going to stronger levels of play and make sure your opponents are consenting to that power level. Don't just bring this against weaker decks, but again, a strong pod, this is a very, very good card. Going to one I really like, though it's a little questionable, is Invasion of Icoria. I like this because it does 2 things that I think are very, very relevant. One, in the main side, it allows you to tutor for any of your non-human infect creatures for 3 mana. Now granted, it tutors for other things later in the game, but I want to look at the floor, and the floor is for 3 mana, you get one of your Death Touch creatures. I said infect, but you know what I mean. Then, of course, on the other side, if you ever flip it, your non-human creatures can assign damage as if they weren't blocked, making them, you know, unblockable in a way which is really, really nice and can knock out players incredibly quickly. This is also, of course, an 8/8 creature, which is very, very powerful. You know all of this. The main reason I want to suggest it is twofold. The first part of it is that this is a very decent floor like I described, but the second part is it fills a niche that I think the deck kind of needs. And this is, what do you do during the turns you don't have access to your commander, right? Because you're not always going to have your commander out. If you think you're always going to get your commander out, you're going to win every game you play. mostly, right? It's reasonable to assume there are going to be turns where you don't have access to your commander. And during those turns, you're going to have a bunch of Death Touch creatures with nothing really to do, because the damage they present isn't really meaningful. Here we have a siege that you can use them to break, right? As we know, sieges are given to your opponent that probably can't block it the best, and then you can do a bunch of attacks to it with the extra Death Touch creatures that don't really mean anything, and you don't have any poison counters to hand out, so you might as well start whittling this down. And I like that. I like that this gives you something to do on the turns where your deck isn't doing great. This is how we avoid win more cards and instead look for cards that are good at all points of the game. There is something to say that your other opponents can attack this siege, but I'm going to suggest you're never going to find an opponent that's willing to do that. But who knows? Politics can make anything happen. Another card that I saw looking around in this deck that really caught my eye was Family's Favor. Don't get me wrong, this is not an amazing card, but there's something interesting here. It basically says whenever you attack, you put a shield counter on a creature, and when that creature hits this turn, you must remove the shield counter, and if you do, draw a card. Now that second bit of text is like a fancy one-turn curiosity effect or keen senses or whatever, where you get to draw off the card that attacks or that hits, but I'm really more interested in that first half. Whenever you attack, put a shield counter on target attacking creature. Why is this interesting? Well, it's interesting because it makes a creature pseudo-indestructible for that attack, right? Whenever it deals damage or would be destroyed, you just remove the shield counter. But your opponents are incentivized to block and not let the hit through. Already because of the whole infect and poison counter scenario, but now even further because, you know, your cards have the ability to draw a card. Now, with that in mind, this card was put into decks where you were attacking with 2/2s and 3/3s, maybe with +1/+1 counters, bigger creatures. But your creatures all have Death Touch, which almost guarantees whatever blocks it dies, and then you just remove the shield counter. Like, this is a very good engine of constantly growing and like getting free attacks in that you no longer need to worry about, and those creatures most likely destroying whatever's in their way, like putting your opponents in the abyss if you're familiar with the term. And I think that's really good. Not even including things like if you can instant speed proliferate, right? And you don't even need to do that, because you can, if you get in like Bloated Contaminator with something and something with a shield token gets in, you can proliferate the shield token before you remove it to draw a card, giving a creature a permanent shield token. And as long as they have that shield token and not that second text, they never lose it when they hit. You don't draw the card, but you actually prefer that. This is kind of a sneaky card, but I really like it. I think there's something profoundly interesting about it. Coming to the end, we've got Trailblazer Boots. I think this is just a fantastic unblockable card that can just be equipped to almost any creature and almost always just says unblockable. I'm sure you could use other unblockable artifact equipment, some that might have Shroud, but I think this one is particularly nice to work with. And that's it. That's our final card and the end of this video. Thank you so much for sending this deck. I really like it. I hope this has been helpful. I fundamentally love aggro decks in Commander. They have a bit of a reputation in on the internet where either people think aggro is impossible, and then you show them an aggro deck and they're like, oh, I don't like that, that's too fast or too mean. And I think this is definitely the fast and mean category, and I love that. So with this, I hope you make some friends. Good luck. Let me know how it worked. And if my suggestions help at all, and good luck and happy deck building. Thank you so much for watching. This video is brought to you by viewers like you and people on my Patreon. If you'd like to send me another draft of this deck, or any deck, there is a link in the video description down below. And if you'd like to make your deck one of my donation decks I work on, there's a link there too. Finally, if you'd like to like, comment, subscribe, I would be very appreciative. It helps the channel quite a bit. Thank you, and good luck in brewing and building.